All right, so today we're going to see if we can wrap this up. We have had these 4 views of the days of creation. And I won't go into all the things that we've been saying as far as what Genesis 1 and 2 teach. Things like we've seen that it is very clearly putting itself in a position where it shows a sovereign God who creates all things out of nothing, who has mankind as central to his plan of creation, and yet even though he makes all things good, it is mankind itself that ends up ruining the creation. All these things are the polemical reasons why this is put in Genesis 1. And we also saw that Genesis 1, and actually the whole book of Genesis, is meant for a people who came out of the Exodus, who needed to learn or to be reminded of who God was and what he had committed himself to doing for them in his covenants. A covenant that he made, of course, initially with Adam, giving him a creation that he then ruins, and then a covenant made with Noah, and then a covenant made with Abraham. And all that we find in the book of Genesis that begins to help the people who have just been redeemed from captivity in Egypt, reminds them of who they are and what it is that God is doing for them. So we've looked at all that. We've also looked at these particular days of creation, or views of the days of creation. There's a number of other views, but these are the ones that fall within the realm of what we would consider to be orthodox and acceptable. I think this is very important because we had a very good question last week. In fact, Timothy, you raised it. It had to do with scientific evidence and so on. And what I've been trying to do here is present that all 4 of these views are what we would call exegetical views. That is to say that they can come out of a study of the text. We can look at the text and we can hold to the text. So for example, the day-age view, which holds that the days are not necessarily 24-hour calendar days, but can be age, and that's based on the fact that the Hebrew word yom can mean a calendar day, but it can also mean an unspecified period of time. And we saw that already in this text, how the word day is used both for a calendar day possibly, also for, God called the daylight portion of the day, the lit portion day, and he called the dark portion night. There was one other use of the word yom, and then in the day in which he made the heavens and the earth. It's this long period of time, that's right. So we've already seen that. Well, you might think that the day-age view only came into being once views in the 19th century began to put forward an older Earth, an Earth that took many, many billions of years to create. But the day-age view had already existed long before we had these scientific theories that posited a very old Earth. Why? Because people could turn to the Bible and actually walk away with a view that was day-age. It was exegetical. It was in the text. So this is the thing that we see for all 3 of these views, is that you don't have to go outside to be able to find what it is that you're looking for. So that's the great strength of all these views. They are all exegetically driven. That's why they are permissible in our view. They also all believe that the account of creation is historical. That is to say that it really did happen. Now, there's some things that we've seen. The calendar day view posits that the 6 days of creation are literal 24-hour days, like on a calendar, just like today. If you sat there with a stopwatch, you'd get 24 hours. We've already seen some of the challenges with that view. Half of the days of creation don't even have the one thing by which you can measure passage of time. They don't have the sun or the moon. So there's already an aspect of extraordinary days, even in these calendar days. The day-age view, I've already talked about it. It's the idea that the days are not calendar days. They may be longer periods of time. The framework view, if you remember, basically said, look, both of these are really nice, but they miss the literary quality. And we looked at how, if you take days 1, 2, and 3 and put them on this side, they create, according to the framework view, the setting for the inhabitants of days 4, 5, and 6. So in day 1, where you create, basically you have the land separated, and you have day 4, the light, I'm sorry, let me try that again. That's actually day 2. On day 1, you get light made, energy made, but on day 4, you actually get the sun and the moon, right? And day 2 was where the land is separated, the waters separate from the sky, and then you get on day 5, the birds and the sea creatures. On day 3 is where you finally have your land, and on day 6, you have your land animals. And so this idea that there's a literary framework by which Moses is actually telling what happened in creation. It claims that the creation is historical, but that there is no scientific data being presented at all, and that what you get then is just this literary view. The days are presented as a literary structure by which you can have creation put forward. And then the Analogous Days view is the one we have not looked at. We're going to be spending some time looking at that today, and it claims that the days are analogous to our work week, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But there are several things then as we begin to gear up towards looking at that we want to just look at again and just be reminded. The calendar day view strictly says, at its most strict level, simply says that the days are like a calendar 24-hour. But in practice, most people who hold to the calendar day view do see it as, and these are the attributes that we've been looking at, see it as a scientific view. In other words, and you can actually find detail in Genesis 1 that helps explain how those things happened. It's technically not something that you have to hold to. You could say Genesis 1 does not present scientific detail and still hold to those days as being literal calendar days. But the truth is the vast majority of people do tend to hold it as also presenting scientific information. The same thing happens with the day-age view. Technically, at the bare minimum, you can just simply say, we hold to those views being, we hold to those days as being longer periods than just 24 hours. But in practice, most people then hold to this, believing that there is scientific data to be found there, and so they tend to also make it match or concord. It's a concordance view with what is being taught by science today, generally, outside of, let's say, biblical scholars. But the interesting thing is, neither one of these views demand that they be seen scientifically, but that's how most of them are understood. Does that make sense? That's a little bit of a distinction. That comes from something that we saw last week, which is a real weakness of both of those views, in my view, is a real weakness. And that's that they don't take into account the creation-providence divide. You remember we talked about that? The creation-providence divide is actually seen already in our confessions and our catechisms. When we talk about what are the works of God, His sovereign works, theologians have for centuries, long before scientific theories in the 19th century started talking about the age of the earth and so on, but for centuries theologians have spoken about God's works being expressed in His works of creation and providence as being separate one from another. Why that's so important is this. The reason that science works today is because of providence. Providence is God's rule over the creation, and it is a systematic rule. His rule is such that you know the sun is going to rise and the sun is going to set within the scope of those 24 hours, and many other things that we can measure and see with consistency so that we can begin to develop and understand the world around us. We can begin to develop a body of knowledge that we call science, and it's based on God's providential rule. If God changed the rules every day, science would never work, because one of the hallmarks of science is that it is repeatable. You can measure something again and again and again. I can sit there and say the speed of light is this much, 186,000 miles per second. And then you can sit on Mars and do that same measurement, and you would get the same result. You could have done that measurement in 1800, and you can do that measurement in 2300 in the future, and it'll still be that same amount. That's because of God's providential rule. But the theologians were always right to say that in creation, God's providential rule is not yet in place. That's an extraordinary work. And so it means that while I can, with providence, look at the way the world works and so back myself up into time, or from your perspective, go back into time and be able to measure something scientifically. It's been this way today, it's been this way today, it's been this way, and every day I measure, I can finally say, well, it probably was that way going back. But you can only go back up to the days of creation. And then once you get into those 6 days of creation, all bets are off. And that is the real weakness, I find, with both the calendar day and the day-age view.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
So at Greenville Seminary, they put out a statement a number of years ago holding to the calendar day view, but they specifically, accordingly, we reject 5 things. But number 3, we reject that ordinary providence was the only way that God governed and sustained the creation during the 6 days of creation. They're saying what you're saying, that it's different. But they're holding to the calendar view by rejecting it.
And I think that's fine. One of the interesting things is people held to this view before scientific, theories, before the 19th century with all these views. They just didn't try to read into it all the stuff that you get. And again, I mentioned, for example, the Institute of Creation Research last week, for which I hold a lot of respect, and which we have, as a church, been involved with, and so on. Those guys are great guys, and they're doing a lot of good work. But there are some other, there's some groups that just go well into it. And by the way, same thing with the day-age guys. Day-age guys go deep into this stuff. And there were guys, if you might have found people in the time of the, let's say, the Westminster Divines, who would have held to this view. But they wouldn't have tried to read into it all the stuff that's in there. What I'm going to show you is that in the end, the Analogous Days view actually is a closer fit to people who held these views before scientific theories on the age of the earth and universe came to be popularized. And I'll show you how that works. But you could have held to that without trying to read all this other stuff into it. So Greenville holds to this because, and I'm presuming just based on other things, I haven't read that statement, and I haven't read somebody saying we hold to this because, but given the professors giving Joey Pipa and his views and others, there's a lot of guys who are concerned, especially with framework, which has become very popular, that literary becomes anti-historical. Day-age gets rejected because it has tied itself so much to a concordist view. Remember, the people who hold to calendar day view today tend to, again, be scientific. They view detail there, but their science does not match secular science. Day-age guys tend to, not always, not only be scientific, but also concordist and try to match it to what secular science is saying today. Again, that's not demanded by the day-age view, but that's where 99% of them are. So again, there are guys who will hold to those views at different varying levels. But I think the big weakness of the scientific is that creation-providence divide. I'm very glad to see that Greenville does note that, but they're going to have to wrestle then with, okay, so you hold to this view because that's a literal reading of the text. It really does say day, and you really believe that they are days.
That's what they say.
Yep, the framework view is the only one that does not hold to a literal, see, these guys will still say it's a literal day. Analogous Days will say it's a literal day. It's just, how do you define literal? And that's where the calendar day view really gets into trouble. And I won't get into that too much here. Some of you have heard me talk about this in other contexts. Vern Poythress, who's a professor of biblical studies at Westminster, extremely intelligent, a mathematician before he became a minister and a theologian, has written an excellent review of this to say that the problem in calling this literal 24-hour day is that the word literal can't be used because you can't literally measure. And he gets into this whole thing that we talked about several weeks ago, clock time. Remember, we even talked about that last week. What's clock time? 98% of the world history doesn't exist in clock time because people didn't have that level of precision. We talked about sundials and how hours were lesser in length and all that. So literal does not work here. A day age, these guys will argue our days are literal. It's right there in the text. But it's just that these guys are presuming that the only reading is 24 hours. When we've already shown that just in Genesis 1, the way the word yom is used in 3 different senses. That's what they're going to have to wrestle with. So let's jump to the Analogous Days view and see, at least understand the view, and maybe at best have you adopt that view as your pastor has done, right? That's the... But any one of these views would be fine. Here's what the Analogous Days views does. It takes into account the creation providence divide. So it sits there and it says, look, this view does not try to read into, as these two tend to do, does not try to read in any kind of scientific theory. It is not, let's see, what was the name of his, Bernard Ram was a theologian about the 50s. He was, when he really was flourishing, right? I think that's how we tend to use that word. Bernard Ram once wrote a statement, I don't remember the exact words, but it was something to the extent of, there is no theorizing in Genesis 1. I think that's almost exactly his quote. There is no theorizing in Genesis 1. It is a conceit of the modern age, which sometimes we don't realize how much, we are children of our own age, to think that Genesis 1 makes no sense to anyone except to a scientific audience like we have today. If Genesis 1 is going to make sense, it has to make sense to every culture and every place and every time. It can't just be something that makes sense to us now. It doesn't mean that we can't learn details and have insights, but it has to make sense without changing and altering its form, right from the very beginning. So the Analogous Days view excels at that because it does believe that the days are literal, but it believes them to be analogous to man's work week, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But it starts by saying that unlike these two views, it is not trying in any way to present science. It's still historical. Everything that happened, happened. And it happened the way that it says that it happened. But it's not trying to theorize and give us scientific level of detail. It's not given to us. Framework view also did that, but the framework view presented as purely literary, which the Analogous Days view rejects. We all see, every view recognizes that literary framework, but to say that it was only a literary construct and that we can have no real knowledge at all of the days, that is something that's rejected by all three views other than framework. So the Analogous Days does see it as literal, but it respects that creation providence divide. The other thing that it does is this, is that it respects the idea that all our views and understanding of God is analogous, and hence the name. Think about it. When we talk about apologetics very often, a man named Cornelius Van Til repopularized the idea of presuppositional apologetics in the mid-20th century. Some of you may be familiar with his name. Van Til also reminded us of something that had already been around. In fact, Herman Bavinck, the great Dutch Reformed theologian of the 19th century, and some might say the leading theologian of the 19th century, and he had plenty of competition with so many other great names of the 19th century, but Bavinck was pure genius and should be spoken of in the same sentence as guys like Calvin. He's at that level. Bavinck reminded us that everything that we know about God is analogous. Now, what do I mean by that? I might have to do some erasing here, but when people think about what we know, and this is going to speak to everything that we're getting at here, when people speak about what we know compared to what God knows, most people today tend to think that, and I know this is not going to make sense, but let's assume that this box is all the knowledge that exists, all the facts. Now, everything, God's knowledge is infinite, so you can't put it in a box, but just go with me on this, right? So this is all the facts that exist, and there's a whole bunch of little facts all throughout, right? God knows it all, and I would just keep doing that, and there's little facts everywhere. The presumption that many people have is that what you and I know compared to what God knows is one of quantity alone. In other words, God knows more than we know. Now, is that true? It's absolutely true. God does know more than we know. So let's just say that this little section is all that man knows. Right? And then all the other things we don't know, God knows them. And maybe over time we might learn a little bit more. We get another fact that we fill in and so on. So the only thing that distinguishes our knowledge from God's knowledge is quantity. He knows more than we know. But guys like Calvin and guys like Bavinck and then Van Til in the 20th century, Van Til is also Dutch. So see, we've got these Dutch guys all nailing things down for us in terms of our epistemology, which is how do we know what we know. Guys like Bavinck reminded us that God's knowledge is different, not just quantitatively in how much we know versus how much he knows, but qualitatively. He knows the same things that we know them, but he knows them in a different way. Now, does that make sense? So, for example, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, let's not even get started into why is that true. Let's just assume that it's true. And it is true, by the way. And if you don't believe it's true, you're a Common Core graduate, and we need to talk. But 2 plus 2 does equal 4. God knows it, and you know it. But here's the thing. God knows it in a way that you don't. There are things about 2 plus 2 equals 4 that you and I do not know that God knows about it. He knows why 2 plus 2 equals 4. He knows why he chose that to be the case. There's levels of 2 plus 2 equals 4 that does not make sense to us and never will make sense because of what's called the creator-creature divide, which is what Bavinck and Van Til, Calvin, and all these guys picked up on. We will always be the creature. He will always be the creator. And it's not just that he knows more, but there's my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways, Isaiah says. To give you an analogy, there's that word. Think about how you think about 2 plus 2 equals 4 as a redeemed Christian versus how an unbeliever thinks about 2 plus 2 equals 4. An unbeliever says 2 plus 2 equals 4, and he agrees with you on one level, but he thinks it's either all because of chance or it's hard baked into the universe because it's the law of the cosmos or whatever. When you say 2 plus 2 equals 4, even though you didn't say it to your friend, behind your thoughts is that there's a sovereign God who created all things, and he sovereignly chose to do that. Even though you're both thinking of the same fact, how you think of them is already different. Now, that's just an analogy to the fact that the same thing happens, our limited knowledge to God's. I'll give you one example. So, for example, here is my coffee mug, and it says Dallas, right? So it's got a picture of the skyline, and if I keep turning it, you can see the entire skyline. It's a skyline that you're all familiar with, I presume, after living here for a while. Now, there's a seam. Can you all see that seam? Okay, you understand what it is. You understand that it's a seam. And when I turn it, it says Dallas, and you can see that, and you can see the Starbucks image. Can any of you see the seam right now? You know it's there, right? So you know that it's there, but you can't see it all at once, just like you can't see the Starbucks symbol now. Can God see it all at the same time, all at once? So you see, you're both knowing this same object. You both know that it has a Starbucks symbol and a seam and all that. But you are unable to see it all at once, whereas God can see it. His experience of this is different than yours. You see? So the point is, it's much more than just quantitative, it's qualitative. God's knowledge of things is qualitatively different. He sees things in ways that we can't, even though it's the same object and the same fact. Does that make sense? Now we start transferring that then, and I want to look at our time. Yep. We start transferring that to other things. So for example, Ephesians 5 talks about the relationship between a husband and a wife, right? Husbands, love your wives. Fill in the blank for me. As Christ loved the church. Okay, so we're being called to love our wives as Christ loved the church. And then Paul goes on to sit there and say, and he talks about the mystery of that, and he sits there and says, but I'm not really talking about husband and wife. I'm talking about Christ and the church. And he tells us that that is the primary relationship. And that human love between the husband and wife is an analogy of that. You see how that works? And it's important because it establishes the reality is actually the relationship of Christ to his church. The analogy is our understanding. It's not that Christ's love for his church is like that of marriage, but the love of marriage is like, you see the difference? Which is the primary one. So we see, for example, in Scripture that it talks about God saves with his mighty right arm. And we say, well, that's anthropomorphic. We're giving God we are actually attributing to God human characteristics. Right? That's what an anthropomorphism is, right? We are attributing God with human characteristics so that we can understand, because he does not have a right arm. But somebody has said it's not an anthropomorphism, it's a theomorphism. Because in reality, the fact that we have right arms is because we're the ones who are made in his image. And we need our right arms, both arms, to be able to do things with power, which God already does automatically. The point is, we never know God as he truly is. He is beyond our ability to understand, except as he reveals himself, which, by the way, interestingly, I didn't plan it this way, is going to be one of the points that we see in the sermon today. When you look at John 1:18, in fact, I'll go ahead and give you a little preview. If you look at John 1:18, Rod, question?
I hate to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
it reminds me, all of this you're referring to, in Romans twice, Paul says, I am speaking to you in human terms.
That's right. Everything has to be, we talk about the condescension. The scripture is God condescending to us. He speaks to us in human language. He condescends to us. And what's the ultimate condescension in which he speaks to us? Jesus. That's why Hebrews 1 is so important. In the old days, in the latter days, God revealed himself through prophets. But in these last days, he reveals to himself to us supremely in his Son. Now, somebody read John 1:18. Right, we have this majestic passage, John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then John 1:14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, glorious of the only begotten, full of grace and truth. Only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And those are majestic, and then we sometimes forget 18. Somebody want to read it?
No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known.
All right. No one has ever seen God. Elsewhere we were told God is invisible. You can't see him. That's what I'm going to talk about in the sermon. The only God, which some manuscripts say, the only God, the Son of God, trying to clarify who is talking about, the one who is at God's side, it's talking about the Word. He has made him known. The only way that you know God is through Jesus. Jesus is prophet, priest, and king, and as a prophet, he reveals the Father to us. What does he tell Thomas? John 14. Show us the Father. And he says, and you know, he's like just been with these people 3 years. Duh, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. All right, you get the idea. So everything then has to come through Christ in the sense that he has to, that's why Van Til would say that every fact must be Christ interpreted. That's a story for another day. We'll do that maybe some other time. The point simply being is that all our understanding of God and of his works is analogous. So I'm going to leave it at that. I could probably go on a whole lot more, but given our time, then let me just say, then what the Analogous Days view does is it says that the days are literal days. They really are days. By the way, they may be 24-hour days, or they may be day-age days, longer days. It's actually, doesn't matter. There are guys who can hold to this view and still hold to that view, so long as you're not reading into the whole scientific and concordance thing. Same thing, you can hold to a calendar day view, as long as you're not reading all the scientific stuff in there and still say that those days are analogous. Because what happens is the days are actually presented in analog to what? To the days of the work week. Take a look at Exodus chapter 20. What do we find there in Exodus 20? 10 Commandments. What was that, Ron? And Deuteronomy 5, that's correct. But let's have somebody read verses 8 through 11. 8 through 11 of Exodus 20.
8 through 11.
8 through 11. If nobody's reading it and you're the first person who's looking right at it, that means that God ordained you before the beginning of time to read it. So jump right in.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. Keep reading.
Yes, verse 11, please, because it's the payoff pitch right here.
For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and that is in them, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy.
Thank you so much, Peter. All right, so here we have the fourth commandment that talks about hallowing, sanctifying the Sabbath day. Our culture has fallen away from that. I'm going to be talking about that when we in our vision series, the importance of the Sabbath, which is since the coming of, and I'm not going to defend that right now, but since the coming of Christ, the Sabbath day is no longer the seventh day, it's now the first day, the Lord's day. But the point is that the Sabbath is of extreme importance to Christians. That has fallen away just fits in with everything else that has fallen away in our day and age. But that's just, like I said, a story for another day. The Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. And, many Christians today hold to the 9 commandments because they tend to ignore that. But it's in there. It's of extreme importance. And what is the basis it talks about for us keeping the Sabbath? For in 6 days. And then it lays out God created everything. And so what we're getting there is that the days of creation, while they are real days, we can't have an understanding of how God actually did it. That's not presented to us in the text. But what is presented to the text is something that would make sense to every single culture. In every single culture, we're used to the idea of making a habitation, right? So if you look now at the 6 days of creation, everything is presented from a earth-centered, geocentric view. It's not a view from out in space. It's a view of what would happen if you were standing there on the earth watching God, the master workman, work for 6 days and create a habitation for man who is going to be his vice-regent. Everything is presented truthfully, but simply in a way that makes sense. Now, if you think about it, the creation of habitation has not changed one bit. Whether you were living back in the earliest days of history or today, we all look at the land. We have to clear the land, get everything set, and then we build a habitation, right? That was true in the pioneer days. That was true in the Stone Age days. That's true today. Developers go out there. It's true in the future. You all watched The Martian, right? What does Matt Damon have to do? He has to clear an area, grow the crops, right? All those things. Nothing's ever, that's what it means to be human. And if you look now at your days of creation, Genesis 1, we see God doing that. Everything is presented in a sense, in a way that, while being true, makes sense to the most basic illiterate culture. There are tribes in the Amazon today that they already know there's other people out there. There's no tribe that has been undiscovered, but they don't interact very much. They still have their little bows and arrows, and National Geographic will occasionally see them, and Brazil is trying to protect them so that loggers don't get near them. They know, they've seen helicopters, and they know that those things exist. Those tribes still have to clear the land and grow their crops and do all that other stuff. Right? It hasn't changed all the way again to future stuff. And if you look at how Genesis 1 is laid out, and I'm going to try to end with this, and then I'll take questions, you'll see that every step of the way is God creating a habitation for man. It's like a master builder who first sets up the basics of light and darkness, and then establishes a surface. Well, they're going to need to stand someplace, so I'm going to have to separate the waters and have a sky, and then I'm going to separate the waters into the oceans and move the land over here. Again, if you were an Israelite who had just been redeemed from Egypt, you watched again and again as the Nile overflowed and destroyed the land underneath, and then it would recede. Of course, that was also what made that land very fertile right along the Nile, because it would have the water come on it and then come off, and that became very rich soil, and they can grow their crops during the season in which the Nile was not overflowing. But if you look at how it's presented here, the waters recede and leave a habitable place. Right? And then, just like in the Nile, when the waters receded, that land remained, and then you can grow crops in it, and then the crops grow there. And then God begins to build all the different parts. You see how that's being presented? Look at the language, which now begins to make sense. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. What do you do during the day? Jesus says it even. There are 12 hours in the day, he said, in which you do your work. And then at night, you stop working. Right? What do you do at night? You rest. Now we understand why he doesn't start by saying morning and evening, the day one, and here's what happened. The first day is not necessarily even Genesis 1:1. The first day describes God beginning to take what he's created and mold it into a habitable place. And it sets up an analogy. In the same way that God works for 6 days, we work for 6 days. So we see him working on day one, and he does his thing. And then there comes evening, and there was morning the first day. He rests during that period. Then the next day, he does some more work, and then he rests. It's the language of the laborer that would have made sense to those people. There was evening, there was morning, and so on and so on. And then on the seventh day, he rests the entire day. He doesn't do any work on that day. And that pattern, because that's the word we're really looking at, that pattern that he establishes becomes our pattern for our work week. You see? And then Exodus 20 tells us that that pattern is actually the basis for the Sabbath day and so on. So the whole week of creation is presented in such a way that it establishes that human pattern. And that's where the analogous days comes in. They're analogous in the sense that our days are analogous to God's creation days. What were those creation days like in actuality? We don't know. This view does not try to extract some kind of scientific theory. You might believe that those days, though literal, may have been longer periods of time, or you may believe that they were literal 24-hour days. The point is, we're not told. We just know that the master workman, and I'll get right, I'm just about done, so I'll take questions. The master workman in those days really did create, in this order, the things that it talks about. The details of how he does it are beyond our ability to understand. And I know that sounds like a cop-out, because a lot of us want to believe that science can figure it all out. But the creation-providence divide takes us right up to that line, and then after that, it has to be purely special revelation. General revelation we can study because of God's providence. We cannot study those 6 extraordinary days. Okay? So I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more that could be said about any one of these things, but we only have about 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to move to questions. Let me start with Rod, who had his hand up first.
And we see it today. And here we are, 33 degrees north latitude, north latitude, moving. All of us are moving at 800 and some odd miles per hour. And it's evening and day, evening and day. And that pattern is with us, as you were pointing out, this very day. Yep. The tide, the moon, the seasons that we have, 23.4 degree tilt, every 365 days or so. So that pattern is there. And just as an aside, besides Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, in our Bible reading plan, going through Leviticus. And there you see over and over and over the Sabbath, the Sabbath, the Sabbath. It's not just in the Ten Commandments, the Fourth Commandment. You see that in Leviticus, and you see it today.
Oh, you've seen the prophets, Isaiah, Malachi. You've ignored my Sabbaths, therefore this is why you're treated this way.
And it's just over and over. It's not just one isolated little place in Scripture.
Yep. The reason the Sabbath falls out, and we don't have much time to get into this, but the Sabbath is a reflection of our respect of God, our respect for God. You spend time with the things that you value. That's the bottom line. So if God says, I give you 6 days, you can do whatever you want in them. Those are your days. 1 day is mine. And you ignore that, he's not of value to you. That's the bottom line. So cultures go the way we go. As the Sabbath goes, so goes the culture. Let's put it that way. So it's not surprising that after we dropped our Sabbath keeping in this nation, and this isn't a reform thing. You know, if you were Anglican, if you were Methodist, if you were Baptist, everybody held to, what would they call, blue laws here in the South, I think, or whatever. Is that what they were called? Yeah, all that flowed from the Sabbath. And it isn't a reform thing. It's only that the Reformed are the only ones kind of sort of hanging on. That's even not even happening in Reformed circles. But as you go in the Sabbath, so goes the culture. So yes, that pattern is there. And what this basically says is, once you can understand that, then everything in Genesis 1 makes sense. And all the little things that these guys have to explain away drops out. It's historical. It recognizes a literary framework without saying that it's the only reason that it's there. It can hold to either one of these in terms of how long those days were. It's indifferent to that. It explains all the word orders. It's not hung up on the different uses of the word day. Seems to be able to handle it. And what I find is that guys who held, for example, to this view prior to the 19th century already tended to view it more like this than that, than the sort of fundamentalist view that's being held today. That it's a 6,000-year-old one, and then we can do science off of it, and it has to do with flood geology and all this other stuff. Let me move on to other questions. Scott.
So this creation providence divide, does that hold that there was no providence on the days of creation?
This, if you want a really in-depth look at that, I mentioned just earlier this book by Vern Poythress. And it's called Interpreting Eden, I believe is the name of the book. And he walks you through that very question in like 4 or 5 chapters worth of detail. Yes, the short answer is, yeah, you can't. You can't say that, for example, the first 3 days were in fact providential days. Now, the calendar day view says, well, we're just going to say that they are because God is consistent. But the text itself doesn't say that. Even days 4, 5, and 6 are still, there's too many things that are different about them to say that you can, with any kind of degree of confidence, say that they're playing out the same way.
To make the hard distinction says that when God created a cow, that cow then, for the rest of that day, operated outside of God's providence?
The way that we define, I think you're misunderstanding the word providence with God's rule. It did not operate outside of God's rule. God's providence, as we have it defined, is his ordinary rule, where everything just follows a set order again and again and again and again. That's the way we're describing it for our purposes here. When we do science, it's because God has taken some things to be regular. When he decides in the day of Joshua to stop the sun, we call that a miracle because he intervenes into that regular pattern of providence, so that we have this, however long it lasted, this day in which did not end because the sun did not set. So I'm not saying God's rule did not exist and he had an independent cow that he launched. His rule is over all 6 days of creation. But this period of where you can measure things, can't say that about those 6 days.
How?
Not in the way that maybe you're thinking, because we're so used to that regular rhythm of things that we just presume it carries up on all the way from Genesis 1. But it can't. Certainly for the first, let me put it this way, if 50% of your creation days already can't even be measured the way that we measure time, all bets are off. Now, it's like building a car or a boat. You can see it taking form, and it looks more and more and more like what you finally want. It's only when you're finally done that you can actually get inside, turn the key, and drive with it normally. Until then, you might be able to turn on the engine. The engine works. Or you might be able to test the electrical system. Yeah, my seats move back and forth. Right? But you can't put it all together until it's finally all done, and then you have your car that works under normal circumstances. It's that kind of analogous example that we have here, if that makes sense. It's a little bit to chew on. That's the problem with trying to present all this in about, 30 minutes, and it's almost, our time is just about up. So just want to sit on that for a while and read it. But that book, I'm sorry, I said Interpreting Eden. Maybe it's Reinterpreting Eden. Maybe somebody can do that quick Amazon check. Say again? Interpreting. Okay, because I know you had asked me about that, and I sent you that book. Okay. By the way, Vern Poythress also has another book on science as a whole called, I want to say Redeeming Science?
Redeeming Science.
Yes. He takes a section of that book and deals with this, creation. Interpreting Eden then is a much broader, it takes that one section and expands it. Either one, if you just want to read the shorter version or longer version, they're well worth it. He's not the only one. You can read John Collins, who teaches at Covenant Seminary, has done a lot of good work on this. He has a book on Genesis 1 through 4, and how we want to properly read those, and he talks about the creation providence divide and so on. You can always go back and read Bavinck. Bavinck has finally been translated in its entirety into English, and some of the better publishing houses produce those works. And Bavinck has a lot to say about those kind of things. Okay, Brandon.
We've heard the criticisms of the first three calendar day and framework view, but just for consistency sake, what is the biggest criticism of the Analogous Days?
The biggest criticism is that some people say, I don't see it. I don't see it. It's actually a criticism of the framework view, that it's too subtle. But it's one of those things that I think we don't see it because we don't have the grand scope biblical view that we should. We don't have the Sabbath day as being as central as it should. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you see, oh, this is God creating in a way that to any pre-modern or modern or technological culture, they all understand the idea of making a habitation that actually makes sense to any culture that picks up Genesis 1 can see it, then you see it. But the biggest criticism is, I don't see it. And usually it takes just a good whap on the side of the head, and then it comes into focus. But until then, that's the biggest criticism. Because it really does answer all the others that we were talking about in terms of tying itself down to science and so on. Like, and I'll get right to you, Chelsea. Like, one of the problems, I was just reading this recently on the Day H, Reasons to Believe with Hugh Ross. I love Hugh Ross, and he's an astronomer, and I share a lot of his beliefs, and he's a good, solid Christian man. There's no knock on Hugh Ross, but his views, he tries, and I already mentioned this, he tries to read things that are not there. He goes to the prophets and tries to read stuff out of it and read it back into Genesis, and most theologians say, no, that's not quite right. He doesn't know what to do with hominids. Y'all know what hominids are? Neanderthals and Homo erectus and Lucy and, all that. He actually believes that there were a number of different humans around, and that only one are the elect humans that we are. And that comes from some rather strange sort of twisting thing, and you just get into all sorts of trouble. The Analogous Days view just kind of sidesteps all that. Now, it leaves us wondering, well, can we know? Yeah, you can still know a whole lot. Science can be done and needs to be done by Christians. And with the Christian, in fact, science was not possible without Christianity. It brought science into being because of its understanding of a providential God who rules. What's Nancy Pearcey's book? It's that wonderful book. It was published in '84. Nancy Pearcey, P-E-A-R-C-E-Y. The Soul of Science. Well worth reading. And it shows that the soul of science is Christian, and that true science is only possible through Christian presuppositions, which is why scientists today don't mind fudging all their numbers for climate change or for anything else, because that soul has dropped out, and therefore truth has dropped out. All right, last one, and then we're going to stop. Chelsea.
Slightly off topic, but I remember reading somewhere that the creation account somebody sort of dismissed it as like, here's yet another, native tribal story about how the world came into being, and it falls after several other major world stories. And
Sure, pagan views.
yeah, this is kind of another pagan story.
So we dealt with that at the very beginning, but very briefly. And I talked about Mesopotamian, Babylonian, and Assyrian, and Egyptian views, and how some people just posited this is another view. And if I had time, I would have taught you guys about evolution, and how now there are some Christians who believe in theistic evolution, and that God is the one who superintends evolution as secular scientists teach it, but it was just God moving all the processes. For them to be able to do that, they have to look at Genesis 1 and 2 and basically say it's not true. Right? I mean, you literally have to do Genesis 2 where God takes man as a special creation and creates him and say, that's not true. And there's guys out there on the evangelical side teaching that at different levels at different degrees. Guys like John Walton, for example, teaching maybe not full out theistic evolution, but that at best Adam and Eve are representative. They weren't the first humans, but they were the ones that God picked to be representative. And then you got people like Deborah Harzma and others of the Biologos Institute who actually claim that really it is theistic evolution. The whole thing is not true, and what they do is they fall into, and I'm going to end with this because now we're really pushing it. In the 30s and 40s, the liberal theologian that is as important as Calvin is to all Protestantism, not just Reformed, the liberal Calvin was Rudolf Bultmann. Rudolf Bultmann taught that we obviously can't believe the details of the Bible. Things like people rising from the dead, Jesus rising from the dead. Nobody believes that. That's pre-scientific. That's pre-modern. That's what ignorant, superstitious people believe. But there's a spiritual truth there, and he uses that idea of a kernel and a husk, an agricultural model. So you get a little bit of wheat, right? And the kernel is the truth, the spiritual truth. But it's presented to us in the husk of a story that's not true. That Jesus died bodily and then was raised bodily. That, of course, nobody believes that. That's the husk. So you take the husk away and you throw it away and you're left with the kernel, the spiritual truth that Jesus rises in our hearts. Okay, and you see how that works. That's nonsense. I don't have the time to get into debating why that is, but that is exactly the view that is being held by people who have to hold to theistic evolution. They go to Genesis 1 and they say, there's a spiritual truth here, that God created and God is sovereign and God rules, but it's presented in a story that itself is not factual and may be discarded. They will never say that, but they may be discarded. Poitras updates the model to less agrarian. He calls it vehicle cargo. The cargo is what's important. The vehicle that brings it to us doesn't matter. You can get rid of the vehicle. What's important is the cargo that's being delivered. Once you hold to that view, you can now turn to, like Bultmann. See, Deborah Harzma, for example, will argue that, and has argued. It's not literal. We don't believe it literally, but there's a truth behind it, a spiritual truth that God rules. And yet Jesus is Lord and he is the Redeemer and he's all. But Deborah, don't you see I can take that same hermeneutic, which is a way of interpreting Scripture, that you just apply to Genesis 1, and I can apply it to the Gospels, and I'm right back where Rudolf Bultmann was, saying these things are not true about Jesus. So those things have all been posited. That Genesis 1 is just a tribal, it's just drawing from all the different myths. And like I said right at the very beginning, the differences that set it apart was in all those other ones, the gods war with one another. And they create the stuff, but there are a bunch of weak gods fighting with one another. Genesis 1 shows that is a one God who is powerful, sovereign, and he creates sovereignly. In all the other accounts, humankind is an afterthought. The blood of Tiamat as she died, or she bled out, becomes the human beings. No, in this account, man is central. And in all those accounts, the world is created as a chaotic world because it's trying to make sense of the chaos around us. And yet in Genesis 1 and 2, the world is perfect. The destruction comes later because of us in Genesis 3. So right from the very beginning, the way Genesis 1 is presented is already a polemic against all those pagan views. There's a whole lot more I could say, but I already touched on those early on. Then there's the issues, and I won't get into this, but I talked about the expanse versus the dome. And the dome is a translation choice in the last 100 years done by liberals to present this idea that pagans believe that the waters literally sit in the heavens and there's a dome that holds them back. And I already talked about how that view is wrong and how the Israelites did not believe that. And we can see it in any way. Okay, I'm starting to say the thing I said I'm not going to say because we're out of time. But I'm happy to talk about all that more in detail. Buy me a cup of coffee sometime. We'll all sit down and have more discussions. Or read some of these books that we've talked about, Interpreting Eden by Vern Poythress for a very detailed account, or his book Redeeming Science for a broader account just on how we approach science as a whole. So, all right, let's go ahead and quit because now I'm ready to have our chief musician looking and saying, come on, get on the stick. All right, let's close. Father, we thank you for this beautiful account in your word. We thank you for the men and women who hold to these 4 different views because they really do believe that this account is true. And we pray that the church would stand fast on the truth of Scripture. And in the same way that Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel in Romans 1:16, may we say the same thing. We're not only ashamed of the gospel, we're not ashamed of any of the truth that you have revealed, including Genesis 1. And we can stand on it even against things that the world teaches when it's contrary to this. By the same token, Father, help us to also see that science, when done properly, is an interpreting of your revelation as well, and is not to be rejected. And so, Father, these 2 things need not be in tension. Help us to stand firmly on both what you have revealed in your word and what you have revealed in creation, never denying one or the other. And we ask this in Jesus' name, amen.